Okay, so you want your lunch, I want my lunch, so let's get going straight forward. Today in this presentation, I want to respond to Martin and the project because it's great that this research is being done. And so I'm kind of sticking a little bit to the bullet points and responding, but I want to put that into some kind of context. But my main kind of takeaway message is to think about trolling as normal now. It's been happening in party politics for the last decade. It's been happening in business for the last decade. So why are the military, what is this devilry? And I know in the last panel there was, okay, we're over it now. We realize that it's not the main thing happening. But there was this kind of panic that maybe set in about a year ago, seems to be symptomatic of broader problems of adjusting to how communication and influence work these days. So I'm going to kind of go into that. But first of all, the context of thinking about this project and going back to what Rebecca said about, well, we can go back to 1987. For me, when I've been listening to these presentations, I've been thinking that certainly in my lifetime, we had broadcast war. We had the Iraq War, the Gulf War, influence fairly linear. And then we went through this post-9/11 phase of diffused war, where influence was non-linear. There was a sense of panic, Abu Ghraib, soldiers might start uploading the wrong things, journalists might get thrown out of their jobs by citizen journalists, and there was a sense of anxiety. Now we've moved on to another phase, but I'd argue that Russia has moved on to that phase a bit more quickly than NATO members. Now we're in a phase of what I call arrested war, where the kind of chaos and contingency and online sort of dynamism has been seized in quite ingenious ways to kind of engage in the influence battle. And it's both top-down and bottom-up. And it's all instrumentalized, and it's fascinating. And what I'm kind of thinking about is responding to Nick Gowing's comment earlier about the West being pretty glacial, being stuck maybe still in the diffused war phase, whereas Russia's moved on to another phase of how we do influence. Now, in my own research, I see this in how strategic narratives circulate. It used to be that we would follow, as Colonel West said earlier, how the narrative is taken to the audience. And then in the 2000s, we thought, well, let's start with the audience and see what narratives they're exposed to, and then see which ones are effective. So we go from the other way. And then over the last 5 years, we've been taking this as a circuit or as an ecology where we try to analyze all these things simultaneously. So, for example, we did this research on radicalization over the last decade in the UK. And obviously, the government is throwing money at the internet and radicalization. So we thought, well, let's start with people who are apparently vulnerable to radicalization and find out what the internet is doing for them or to them or with them. And we found out that television was by far the most important influence on them. What would happen was that young Muslims or young people who are vulnerable would get home from school, they'd have their dinner with their family, they'd watch BBC News, they'd look at their parents, they'd see that something's happening in Israel, young Muslims or young Arabs are being killed, their parents are just sitting there, they go to school the next day, did you see television last night? Yeah, well, what should we do about it? And then gradually it was, and we did a lot of research on this, our findings were confirmed by the intelligence agencies, but they said, well, we can't shut down the BBC. That can't be done. Let's stick to the internet, that's safer. But if we're really concerned with influence, then you've got to be ecological. You've got to take television alongside cyber, and of course those are meshed together quite interestingly. So moving on to the project that was introduced to us today, it's interesting because it does social media, but it also does some audience analysis, and that's so important. There have been lots of studies of social media and influence over the last 2-3 years that don't really get at audiences. So it's great to see that there were focus groups done, and you can begin to kind of build a patchwork of how people use media in their everyday lives. And I would, if you've got any money left, go back to the focus groups and ask, well, what do you think of trolls generally? When you see them in fashion blogs or football blogs, or they're everywhere. They're a fact of the public sphere now. So it was really useful that somebody brought up media literacy in the first panel this morning, because my hunch would be that people are a bit more literate about this than we give them credit for. And it's interesting that you found that Latvians are fairly resistant to quite a lot of this Russian influence behavior. Certainly cognitively, if not emotionally. So And as I say, this is happening everywhere. So I've kind of working in political communication, we've had astroturfing in party politics where you pay people to say certain things online. This goes back to the early 2000s, if not before. We've had Amazon with its Mechanical Turk, where you pay people small amounts of money to do some menial tasks for you, or all kinds of businesses are now using this model. So now we suddenly see this happening in Russia, and it's like, well, of course, why aren't we doing this? It almost seems we shouldn't be looking to Clausewitz or Machiavelli or Sansi. We should just be looking at the Financial Times in about 2005. That's what's happening now in war. So should we be looking at the Financial Times or the Economist now to find out if, or where we're heading, what models of communication and influence are going to be brought in from the economy, from other sectors, into the military? Because this, I think, going back to Nick's point about being glacial, this is why their NATO members are behind. So just to wrap up, because I know we're kind of running out of time for the panel, what's really important going forward, and I'd argue this for this research centre of StratCom here, is to take an ecological approach to communication, not to silo social media, not to silo cyber. Because going back to Colonel West's so what question, if we want to understand what difference trolls make or don't make to the audience, you need to start with the audience, or at least spend as much money researching the audience as whoever is producing the content. Now, this is really difficult. It takes a lot of time and effort, and people with lots of different language skills to trace where a piece of information flows around the internet. If you're just taking one YouTube clip, it can, it circulates for maybe 6 months if it's particularly powerful. Some of the wreckage videos and photos. So this is not easy, but it's got to be done. Otherwise, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. Secondly, my final point as well, just to wrap up, is that, as the Defence Minister said, you need to look 3 steps forward. Or what kind of knowledge, where do you look for to make those 3 steps forward? Looking to other sectors, I would argue, is the way to go. Because looking at the Russian military or looking at the Chinese military, yes, you've got to do that just to know what they're doing, but not necessarily to learn how to get 3 steps ahead. If you're looking at what they're doing now, you're always going to be 3 steps behind them. Thank you very much.